Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello, in this lecture number 3 of the course on folklore studies, we are going to understand the interface of folklore and history, the kind of history writing, historiography happens, and how folklore figures in historiography. And as an implication of this interface, we also enhance our understanding of folklore. As we noticed in the previous 2 lectures, our discussion on the nature and scope of folklore and approaches to folklore gave us a synoptic idea as to how various notions about folk and lore come into some kind of interplay, creating varied tropes of understanding. In this lecture, we continue with our discursive trope building exercise, which will help us understand what folklore means in South Asian context. To start, one should notice that along with folklore studies, about which we had discussion in the previous 2 lectures, along with folklore studies, changes were being witnessed in case of history too. The term history from below was coined in the 1930s by Georges Lefebvre. It was with the writings of Marxist scholars like E.P. Thompson that this gained momentum in the decade of 1960s in 20th century. Many more Marxist scholars contributed to our understanding of folklore. They all together constitute what could be considered a Marxist approach to folklore, and that was also shaping up the engagement with folklore in formal discipline of history. Similar ideas found space in the forms of cultural history, and history of mentalities through exponents like Emmanuel Leroy Ladurie and the Annals School, the famous Annals School, which propounded the idea of doing social history by looking at some of those materials which may not be very suitable following the positivist way of doing historiography. The idea was to understand the real people when talking about history from below. This would expand the boundaries of social history. This was a space to understand, analyze and evaluate the lives of all those histories that had not been recorded yet. And these included the peasant class, the emerging working class, women, children, and other activities of those who were considered less significant, who were deprived, marginalized, and later on also called subaltern. In subaltern school of historiography, therefore, we find great deal of engagement with materials which may be classified as materials coming from oral traditions. Subaltern historiography gives a new spin to the idea of doing history by engaging with folklore material without any hesitation, with a different kind of, with a new kind of intellectual confidence and justification. And with this kind of interface between folklore and history, we also begin to look at some of the vernacular terms, vernacular interjections in the discussion on folklore. Folk thereby also begins to appear as lok Lok has been a category of study since a very ancient time in ancient South Asia. Terms such as Lokachara, Lokariti, Lokdharmi were used in order to refer to the category of folk in vernacular discourse on folklore. Other such terms that have been used to refer to folk include Deshi and Marga. Desi and Marga, Desa and Marga. They were also the terms very central to the discussion given to us by a Sri Lankan Orientalist scholar Ananda Kumaraswamy when he discusses the relationship of art and civilization, art and socio-religious civilization in various parts of South Asia, particularly in Sri Lanka and India. He uses the category of Desa and Marga. Desa for folk and Marga for classical. These meant the regional and local culture and styles that are quite different from the elite ways of living. Oral narratives were being collected and recorded by scholarly persons. A historian, a social historian interested in folklore like Jan van Sina. Jan van Sina tried to offer us a perspective through which we begin to understand that oral materials are potential sources of creating social history. There exist several popular and renowned such collections in the context of South Asia. Some of the local materials become very crucial in this discussion therefore. Say for example, the Buddhist Jatakas, the Panchtantras, the Katha Sarit Sagara, the Hitopadeshas, and such monumental textualized sources of tales and ideas. They are very significant in a discussion on folklore as far as the cultural contexts of South Asia is concerned. Some of these collections date back to several years. For instance, the Jataka tales are approximately 2000 years old, while the popular Panchtantras and Katha Sarita Sagaras are approximately 1500 years old. The popularity of these collections is evident from the fact that volumes of Panchtantra, for example, have been translated in innumerable languages, including Arabic, Persian, German, Italian, and so on. These acted as source of inspiration for the Grimm brothers in order to revolutionize the study of folklore and folk tales in the context of Germany. And why only these printed materials? Also some of the famously known epics such as the Ramayanas and the Mahabharata are supposed to have relation with the bardic tradition, the oral tradition of the famous bards who went around narrating stories, and finally they have been stitched together to form one classical epitome, one classical tome famously known as the Epic of Mahabharata. Going further ahead in our discussion on the relation between folklore and history, we find out that it was in the journal of the Royal Asiatic Society of Bengal, established in 1774, that the folkloristic began with a compilation of collected songs and tales. A meager collection of around 24 articles was done in the first 100 years. This trend, however, changed from the year 1872 onwards, when James Burgess initiated Indian antiquity. Indian antiquary encouraged search for legends and myths, folk tales and folk songs, traditions, and so on. Thus, the interest in their publication gained momentum. Along with publications in journals, a gradual interest in compiling the stories and songs could also be witnessed. The contribution of journals like the Journal of the Anthropological Society of Bombay, which came up in 1886, is also important in this regard. These journals encouraged research and publication of folklore materials. Publication dates back to the year 1868, when the Old Deccan was compiled and published by Mary Frere. This was the first collection of Indian folk tales. Then came the year 1879, when Indian Fairy Tales was published by M. Stokes. Folklore from Punjab was published by Flora Steele and Sir R. C. in 1884 with the title Wild Awake Stories. In the same breath, one should mention that the Indian fables of Panchtantra, Jataka stories, etc. are collection of folk stories dating back to very early times, and this reminds us to reiterate a learning from the first lecture, that it was the collection of fairy tales and stories by Grimm brothers in 1812 that marked the beginning of this form of folklore studies in the West. In the context of India, gradually other scholars also began recording the oral literature and publishing them. However, historians inform us that in the wake of this collection and recording and publishing of the oral materials in the context of South Asia was also subject to the power dynamics performed along the line of caste and class, which means folklore associated with upper caste found central stage as far as publication and circulation was concerned. Folklore which were essentially associated with lower caste and women did not gain immediate attention of the collectors and publishers at the earliest stage in South Asia. At the earliest stage of folklore studies in South Asia, it was the elite, class elite, well versed in textual traditions and interested in the light of textual tradition, interested in the folklore of upper caste and upper class in South Asia, that appears to be more dominant. However, the folklore of lower caste and women also began to find space sooner than later. At the onset of recording this form of history through folklore, concentration was given on groups and communities of people which were untouched by the modern development, for instance, the gypsies, the peasant class, or so on. However, this is only textbook understanding, because scholars have also informed that the consideration of upper caste, upper class in the light of the discussions in classical traditions, Sanskrit texts, that was something more prominent. This was done in order to preserve, however, their so called archaic customs in ways that it does not get lost. The ideas of prehistoric man was being reconstructed through folklore by anthropologists in Western context, by anthropologists such as Sir Edward Taylor, Andrew Lang and others. The Golden Bow of Sir James Fraser is a prime example of such attempts. Coming back to the context of South Asia, different stages of development of the new and modern folklorists, folklore studies began in India. This has been traced very nicely, very lucidly by B. Datta. In the post-independence period, departments of folklore began to set up in the country. It was in the year 1955 that Biranchi Kumar Barua established one of the earliest such department at Guwahati University. According to him, the period from 1980s saw surfacing up of new perspectives and extensive research by folklorists. Jawaharlal Nehru also gives us an idea about the archaeology of folklore in South Asian context and how folklore research was deeply influenced by the idea of power and the idea of cultural politics. The systematic study of folklore began in 1980s in India with the setting up of Central Institute of Indian Languages and the American Institute of Indian Studies. The aim was to bring the academic study of folklore and the community contribution of folklore together. This also provided space and motivation for scholars to take up the study of folklore zealously and add newer dimensions of analysis to the existing ones. Some of the pioneering folklorists should be named here, pioneering folklorists from India such as Jawaharlal Nehru, Lalita Nehru, Somen Sen, Chitra Sen Pasayat, Sadhana Naithani, B.N. Datta, N.C. Sharma, Kishore Bhattacharya, Anjali Padhi, Kailash Patnaik, V.A. Vivek Rai, late Komal Kothari, Raghavan Payanad, M. Ramakrishnan, and many others. Most of the scholars began understanding and analyzing folklore from the Indian context only rather than taking up Western models of study. Another prominent scholar who analyzed folklore from Indian context and whose name has appeared in previous lectures as well was A.K. Ramanujan. With his extensive knowledge, he added to several disciplines, folklore being one of them, literary studies in English being another of them. His focus had been on folklore and poetry arising from the Indian context specifically. For instance, in the texts such as Where Mirrors Are Windows and 300 Ramayanas. In such texts, Ramanujan highlights the intertextuality which marks the Indian literature. Intertextuality in the sense that is the flow from the written, the printed and oral that creates a literary surrounding in ancient South Asia. Some of his works in the field of folklore are articles and commentaries like Where Mirrors Are Windows, which is an anthology of reflections by A.K. Ramanujan. There is another kind of collection of love poems from a classical Tamil society, and folk tales from India, oral tales from 20 Indian languages. These are some of very powerful collection by A.K. Ramanujan. One has to be reminded of the interface of colonial history and interest in folklore that one witnesses in colonial South Asia. There were many cultural nationalist folklorists who wanted to distinguish the folklore of power elite from the folklore of the ignorant, peasant, rural masses. Guru Sade Dutt in the context of Bengal happens to be an important name, who paves the way to start engaging with folklore coming from various sources. However, it is also a struggle to engage with folklore in the context of colonial Bengal. Colonial Bengal, which had a territory which is now known as Bangladesh, and various provinces from India such as Odisha, Bihar, Assam. In this large landmass, one envisaged the gold mine of folklore. However, one also had to struggle against the moral codes which had come into effect because of the dominance of reformist vision. The reformist vision which was prevalent amongst Bhadralok elite Bengali, educated elite Bengalis, the Brahmo Samaj, the kind of reformist zeal which aided in understanding Bengali culture in a very different light. In that kind of situation, it was a tiny bit of struggle to engage with folklore. Among the nationalist folklorists, one name comes up prominently, and that is of Rabindranath Tagore. How nationalist it was, it is debatable, but one has to understand his contributions toward it. He established the Bangiya Sahitya Parishad, in English, Literary Society of Bengal, in 1893. Folklore from various regions of Bengal started making appearance here every quarterly. It is through the folklore that he attempted at highlighting and bringing out the soul of the people. A different and new kind of cultural consciousness was being developed through folklore by Tagore's contemporaries like Kaka Saheb Kalelkar, Jhaved Chand Meghnani, Ram Naresh Tripathi, Lakshminath Bezbodwa. They started focusing on the earlier neglected folklore genres. Simultaneously, one has to understand that anthropology as a discipline contributed immensely through its methods in understanding folklore. And in this regard, one has to think of some of the folklore thinkers and writers who have made significant contributions in the context of India. Devendra Satyarthi, Krishna Dev Upadhyay, Jhaved Chand Meghani, as it was mentioned earlier as well, Prafulla Datta Goswami, Ashutosh Bhattacharya, Kunja Bihari Das, Chitra Sen Pasayat, Somnath Dhar, Ram Garib Chaube, Jagdish Chandra Trigunayan, and many others. These folklorists contributed to the domain of folklore to a great extent, even though this was focused more on the literary aspect than analytical. A good boost was given to the sidelined domain of folklore studies. So, how do we understand folklore in the face of history? It would be wrong to consider folklore as something static, and this is something which has been said several times in previous lectures as well. Folklore crosses boundaries, changes with changing communities, regions and people. The culture, stories and civilization of the past combines with the future through folklore. There exists a continuous flow of past to present, making folklore a continuing phenomenon. This is despite the fact that the beginning of folklore studies itself was premised upon this apprehension that folklore is going to disappear, and hence we should rush to collect them, preserve them, so that we have something of it, some survival of it before it entirely dies out. But then there is also this notion that folklore is continuing, and therefore a complete death of folklore is just an imagined apprehension. Folklore, as we understand, cannot be compartmentalized in any single discipline. It cuts across subject matters of disciplines like anthropology, cultural studies, linguistics, sociology, philosophy, and so many more. And this was reflected upon while trying to offer a brief discussion on various approaches to folklore in lecture number 2. All the disciplines impart a unique understanding to the study of folklore. Attempts have been made to theorize folklore since a very long time. It is important to note that folklore is not a simple oral transmission from one generation to another. It is, in fact, it transmits entire knowledge systems through cultural norms, emotions, codes of conduct, experiences and belief, individual and community identities, religious and political sentiments, nationality, and so on. Thus, the task of defining and categorizing folklore in concrete terms remains an onerous one, even in the context of South Asia, where historical encounters with folklore makes the matter more complicated. The entire folklore can be broadly understood in 2 parts. This includes what the folk do and what the folk say, the action and speech. Tradition then becomes embedded into the folklore. Entire traditional knowledge system, beliefs, tales, practices, all that are disseminated informally through the way of speaking form a pivotal aspect of folklore. The interest in studying the roots of the nation and concentrating on its spiritual aspects was considered as part of romantic nationalism, as it was told in the first lecture. According to B. Datta, enthusiastic groups of people who felt a kind of romantic nostalgia for the past and who were also driven by the spirit of nationalism got themselves involved with the collection and documentation of folklore material, and this was in the context of South Asia. The main agenda was to use the past, which was generally considered as a glorious one. This glorious past helped in reconstructing more recent social history as well as the present. Thus, the links with tradition were being utilized. On the contrary, the colonial understanding of the past was one of rupture and backwardness. The past was then not linked to the elites, and the folk formed an important part of this. This, according to them, was unyielding, belonging to the pre-industrial and pre-literate era. In fact, many scholars took into account the analysis of the creators and providers of the folklore. These gave them a perspective closer to the origin and roots of the folklore. There exists a difference of perspectives between the folklore user and the theoretician. An amalgamation of the two provides an interesting understanding of the given folklore. While the folklorist can get a more transparent and real meanings of folklore from the users, by providing this understanding can help in building up new analysis of the entire folklore. And in this background, one has to return to some of the materials coming from South Asia, such as myths, Puranic myths and folk myths. According to A.K. Ramanujan, they can be differentiated. Puranic myths and folk myths can be differentiated. In Ramanujan's view, folk myths can be considered as an extension of the Puranic myths. However, they generally connect the perception of the daily to a mythical incident and reason. Their stories might be similar also. However, this is so, except that we see them not in texts but in everyday speech, in a collective yet diachronic process. Which takes us back and forth in time. The stories, which are varied, reworked, etymologized, informed and garbled by successive tellers. We need to understand all of them if we want to see the connection between the Puranic and the folk, which means the connection between the classical textual tradition and oral folk tradition. The character building with folk narratives is very interesting. The good looks extremely good and the bad is totally bad, who at times realizes their mistakes at the end of the story and also struggle for redemption sometimes. These are extreme character play. While some tales use animals as their main protagonists, others use humans. The animals, however, talk and behave totally like human beings. These are some of the features emerging from folklore in South Asia. They can be understood as personifying the human behavior, the animals in these stories or in these folk performances. Magical wonders and elements of supernatural remain a focus in folklore in South Asia. The hidden always raises curiosity, and it is this curiosity that adds to the interest of such folk tales. Anecdotal folk tale is always refreshing, as it uses humor as a way of putting across its message. An interesting example of folklore through folk tales is the popular stories of Akbar and Birbal. Now, there is no factual verification available for the stories about Akbar and Birbal. However, we hear those stories, which are also available in print in various ways, we hear them, we read them with due seriousness, culling out folk wisdom, traditional wisdom from them. History constructs a curious and pragmatic image of Akbar, a historical character. His policies, economic, social, political, religious, all mixed with new ideas and beliefs. He seems to be emerging as a king who is interested in each and every aspect of his kingdom and depends heavily on his trustworthy men. His company of intellectuals has been written about a lot, and they form a major segment of folklore emerging from the time of Akbar as the main character. Akbar in the main lead, and during his time many other men in his court occupy our folk story space. While texts like Akbar Nama and Abul Fazl construct Akbar as a powerful king who was later considered as a representation of almost God, the folk tales around Akbar uses him as a figure who is aware of the problems of his kingdom. In the two texts, Akbar emerges as someone who embodies miraculous powers. The example of his powers is seen through the example being cited where he could bring down rain through his prayers during the time of drought. All these signify the importance of kingship, and Akbar as a prototype practicing this kingship. The Navaratna or the 9 jewels form an important part of Akbar's court. These included the famous Tansen, Todarmal, Abul Fazl, Man Singh, Faizi, Abudus Samad, Mir Shirazi, Davant and Birbal. Birbal surfaces in tales related to Akbar where he emerges as the brightest of all jewels. According to James Mosley, this is where the popular understanding of Akbar Birbal emerges. According to him, it is not possible for all these 9 men, all these 9 jewels, the Navratan, to remain alive throughout at the same time. Birbal was born in 1528 as Mahesh Das. He was the 3rd son of Ganga Das and Anabha Davito, a Brahmin family of minstrels. Being an unusually bright student, he gained knowledge in Hindi, Sanskrit and Persian as well. With his talent for all sorts of sources of knowledge including music, he gradually earned the reputation of a great wit, a man with great wit, who was also a gifted singer and a poet. He was the jester in the powerful North Indian ruler Raja Ram Chandra Bhatta's empire, who was also a great patron of arts. Birbal got employed in Akbar's court somewhere between 1556 and 1562. The title of Kavi Rai was bestowed on Birbal by Akbar within a decade. Birbal, aka Kavi Rai, was an accomplice to Akbar during his successful Gujarat campaigns. Why are we saying so much about Birbal? To help ourselves understand that beyond texts, Birbal acquires a larger than life personality, almost matching the personality of the Emperor Akbar. V.A. Smith remarked that Akbar's love for Birbal is evident from the proximity of their lodgings. Birbal was the only person from the court who could reside within the complex of the palace in Fatehpur Sikri. One of the 9 gates of the city is named after Birbal as Birbal's Gate, which means folk narration of historical characters assume great deal of significance. There are many such stories, even including the story of Akbar Birbal, in which Birbal would poke fun at the emperor. And there are many other stories which will be stories to poke fun on general level at the human imperfections in the character of the king and suggest a corrective to his behavior. Thereby, folk imagination becomes so important. This is not to just tell about Akbar Birbal, it is also to give an idea that there has been a trajectory of folk characters acquiring greater momentum. Historians have paid attention to many of these episodes coming from history. Harbansh Mukhia helps us understand the interjection of folk material in the historical episodes. Folk tales then become a way of understanding political history. They are more than just simple commentaries and bring out the existing traditions contextually. And in that context, in that regard, the story of Akbar and Birbal offers us a prototype. Likewise, the story of Tenali Raman would be a prototype, which will suggest as to how history and folklore come face to face to generate a different kind of social historiography. According to Henry Glassy, dismissed as lies and humbled with servitude, folk historical texts cry for contexts of their own. Rarely have scholars answered. Folklore comprises of what can be seen as social products, that is to say, it is derived from the very environment it talks about. The folk then carry out and transmit these as reflections of society. Thus, these reflections keep changing and cannot be seen as dead entities. Folklore includes a host of things ranging from drawings, paintings, pottery, woodwork, jewelry, handicrafts, metalwork, sculptures, carvings, mosaic, indigenous textiles, songs, riddles, and so on, and they all matter a lot in the craft of writing history. With passing time, history has begun to incorporate previously overlooked categories of social life. Along with this, there has been a trend to accommodate different sources of study too. Folklore emerges as one such unconventional and unique source. Any particular folk story or song or drama all carry a peculiar reflection of the social and economic condition of a certain time, of a certain group of people. One remembers some of the folk performances largely associated with the lower caste, however, also watched and admired and discussed by folks across caste groups. Some of these folk performances are available in length and breadth of South Asia. Just for the sake of example, one can name the performance of Raja Salhes and Chuhar Mal, popular amongst lower castes groups in UP and Bihar. In such performances, there is also a tendency to subvert the social order, the moral order along the line of caste. In these kind of performances, such as in the performance of Chuhar Mal, one begins to realize that a thief named Chuhar Mal is being celebrated because of his humanistic orientation. There's so many such performances, such as the performance of Alha Udal. In these kind of performances, one witnesses the possibility of creating social history. One can start with these performances and can go out in historical context to find more details for social historiography. Likewise, there are songs sung by women which will give instances of historical migrations. The large trope of Bidesiya songs, originally in Bhojpuri language, gives us that possibility to understand the history of indentured migration during colonial times. In Bidesiya songs, there is a lament about getting dislocated. There is a pining about waiting for those loved ones who have gone to work in plantations in far-flung regions. Some of these kind of materials become potential sources of writing history. It is this reflection that becomes an important insight in understanding history of those people. Folklore then becomes more than just some pieces of recorded information. When understood and analyzed in their total context, they provide the most interesting, unusual and significant analysis to history. Folklore cannot be studied in isolation, therefore. It is made up of interaction between people and their surrounding, between different social, political, cultural contexts. This meant an entire shift in the focus of studying and writing history. From the focus being on the kings, rulers, white-collared officials, the shift could be seen on the subordinated. This led to a new social history encompassing cultural, economic and political aspects of these communities. For instance, more often than not, invisible historical narratives like that of women, racial minorities and others started making headway. It was around the similar time period in 20th century, it was mid 20th century, that gender history and feminist studies also started gaining prominence in the academic discourses. These also formed an interesting nexus with folklore studies. For a long time span, most studies had remained silent on discussing certain communities, gender and other parts of social life. Folklore played a significant role in filling up the gaps arising from such negligence. It made filling up of these gaps easier. In a very layman understanding, folk was generally understood as something connected to being backward or uncivilized. The literate was not related to folk. This was an extremely narrow and misleading understanding of the concept, and this has granted a multidimensional approach to study folklore, creating different approaches of understanding and analysis. Methodological concerns have expanded in the light of the role folklore can play. The folklorists do not restrict themselves only toward studying the folklore texts. Boundaries of folklore studies have expanded over time. The amalgamation of elite and folk cultures, diffusion of disciplines and others are important aspects of folklore studies now. It cuts across the boundaries of disciplines, which has been also mentioned earlier, such as sociology, anthropology, literary studies, gender studies, and therefore someone like Jawaharlal Nehru, who offers us a history of folklore research in India, he would suggest that in the present day situation, any item of folklore is considered as a living aspect which has changed the entire panorama of theoretical bias, and folklore specialists begin thinking of their areas of inquiry as a living phenomenon with hopes both for the present and the future. In the light of this kind of discussion, one begins to see that the aspect of we rather than I provides the opportunity for multidimensional analysis of folklore. The connection of folklore to society is a universal idea, it is a truism. However, Stuart Blackburn and A.K. Ramanujan, the folklorists, they try to show us through their survey of the kind of folklore researches which have happened. They show us the possibilities of studying folklore in such a manner that it would be able to include multiple voices. In their own words, folklore must be studied in all its forms. We should not neglect the most contemporary. How does it respond to the urbanization, mechanization and cash economy that are reshaping Indian society, or at least large segments of it? These are the challenges for folklore studies at present, who would like to take into account the details coming from history. Once the folklore is recorded, the space for flexibility and changes shrinks. However, before recording, folklore maintains its fluidity. These are mostly connected to the realm of the world, real world. At times, it is to show that the transformation of folklore is an inevitable reality. However, in spite of that transformation, we do not begin to doubt the essential characters of folklore which passes from time to time, from generation to generation, which is retained despite a lot of changes. A.K. Ramanujan, for instance, points out in the story of Bhai Dooj, a famous folk festival to celebrate the relationship between brother and sister, a festival popular in northern part of India. In a festival like this, the brother wishes to see her sister in new clothes and thus plans to visit her after Deepavali, the festival of light. However, on the way, the brother faces several difficulties. The tree wishes to fall on the brother, the river wishes to wash him away. All animate and inanimate objects are speaking here. The brother informs them all about his visit to his sister, so that his life is spared until then. Brothers form a linking point for the sister after her marriage to her natal home. Thus, their bond is characterized by quality of protectiveness and unbound love for each other. It is believed that if you greet a guest when your thread is broken, harm will come to that guest. The sister thus does not greet her brother. They visit a dangerous jungle together, wherein the sister gives a necklace to the river, a cup of milk to the snake, a goat to the lion. She saves her brother from all these dangers. The story goes on. There is a picturesque bond depicted between siblings through this folk tale. Women's tales can be considered as counter narratives of the visible reality, and thus they provide several interesting insights. The story is thus an example of depicting human relationship and emotions. However, it also invites feminist approach to folklore, which would amount to suggesting some kind of gendered power relations between brother and sister. It also invites another kind of reading which would probably emphasize the patriarchal principle at the ground of which this story celebrates the relation between brother and sister. These multiple readings of same folk tale, however, is not meant to diminish the significance of folk festival and folk tale. It is rather to enhance our richer understanding of the same material. What we understand from such materials, the desires, aspirations and dreams of the human species, that is reflected in folklore. It is through the characters of folklore, for example, that the wisdom and victories as well as shrewdness and failures is depicted. It gives us a broader idea about human history without compromising on the essential human attributes. And therefore, this too becomes an essential component as far as the interface of folklore and history is concerned. We come to state this axiomatic understanding now that folklore and history are intertwined. Methodologically, certain kind of historiography may not be compatible with folklore. However, there are various approaches within history which will show us the significance of folklore. Folklore can be a very important tool in writing history, we have understood. This is true in the case of South Asia and especially in India. In the context of northeastern region too, the role of folklore includes preservations of identities and expanding. It helps in retaining what is belonging to a particular community and also helps in ensuring a way forward. Thus, it becomes a precious way of defining and explaining society, people, identities, marginalized people, subaltern, labor, women, tribes, ethnic groups, and so on and so forth. Folklore depicts the cultural heritage and it becomes an essential segment of constructing history. Folklore in the form of traditional knowledge has received a lot of attention in several debates and policies ranging from agriculture, health, environment, cultural issues and economic development. Traditional knowledge has gained prominence in many domains including these as well as in scholarship. The writing of history also relates to these. Writing of history takes into account various aspects, political, economic, social, religious, civilizational, about which we get informed in the process of writing history from the sources associated with oral tradition. Though folklore can add immensely to the study of history, there also exists certain kind of limitations. The role of historian becomes crucial in this regard. Someone like J.B. Bhattacharjee has put it very aptly when he says that historians will not use folklore as a source without examining the acceptability of the information according to the standard methods of verification of sources and elimination of the possible impact of ignorance or motive or compulsion in each narration. The use of folklore material is recommended when the standard sources are either scanty or absent, or the folklore is able to provide additional information or to supplement the conventional sources. An unconventional interest in folklore can lead to unconventional consequences. This is an imagination not yet explored. Everything people say or do can be an integral part of folklore, and therefore, in some of the latest explorations of folklore, we find that the divide of classical and folk have been minimized by showing the dialogue between little tradition and great tradition without giving priority or supremacy to either of these two. There is also an attempt when one is trying to understand the interface of history and folklore, there is an attempt to show the contemporaneity of folklore. Like history is continuing, so is folklore, and that warns us rather against the potential museumization which may happen of both history and folklore. However, we attach certain kind of uniqueness to folklore. We are reminded of the limitations in the sense that folklore can also become the cultural site of political contestations, and in that kind of situation one has to treat very carefully. We also understand when it comes to the contemporaneity of folklore that there is a necessity to protect it from all kind of misappropriation. An international agency such as UNESCO undertook a joint venture to address some of these apprehensions. The intellectual property aspects of the traditional knowledge and folklore were discussed. This led to the model provisions for national laws on the protection of expressions of folklore against illicit exploitation and other prejudicial actions. Developing countries like Africa, Sri Lanka, Indonesia, China and others framed national laws in this regard. These helped in providing a protection framework through copyright laws and regulation of folklore creations. However, the problem of lack of clear understanding and definition of what falls under national heritage has been a drawback for these laws. Folklore here becomes a part of national heritage and cannot be submitted to the guidance and protections by a few people, even its creators. In nutshell, if one has to think of the interface of folklore and history, one would not be able to find it possible to avoid the discussion on tradition and modernity. The axis of tradition and modernity in South Asia has been very dominant axis. Scholarship in any form has been guided by this axis. Engagement with these categories has amounted to a very thick corpus of knowledge, and this therefore also includes the interface between folklore studies and history. Folklore and history come together to give us uniquely interesting kind of relation between the tradition and modernity. If one has to bring in the category of contemporaneity of folklore, probably it becomes possible to upset the comfort that is created by the binary opposition of tradition and modernity. As we know, in colonial South Asia, these binaries have been always critically revisited, in the sense that many of the scholars looking at the materials coming from medieval history would tend to argue that modernity in South Asia probably goes back to the time of medieval history and not necessarily colonial history. With colonial history, with colonial historical encounter in South Asia, a different kind of modernity comes into picture. It's the kind of modernity which is typically expressed in the idea of imagined community, nation as imagined community, whereas modernity which is pre-colonial gives us an idea of nation with a lot of fuzzy boundaries woven around the corpus of folklore. The binary opposition between modernity and tradition therefore comes to receive an interesting kind of creative setback. However, one also is reminded of the kind of civilization mission which was associated with folklore, exploration of folklore in South Asia, and it was because of that civilization mission associated, a scholar like Guy Potvin would consider it some kind of empire theory of folklore coming into picture in colonial South Asia. George Campbell, an exemplary ethnologist and governor of Bengal, in fact asked the Asiatic Society to add an exhibition of Aborigines, the primitive, at the agricultural exhibition. Even native folklorists continued this trend in order to uphold Brahminic supremacy of the thoughts, such as a magazine named Braj Bhasha Academy in 1940 showed us. Historians have given us plenty of currents and countercurrents of their engagement with folklore, and needless to say, it has been furthermore enhanced by the category of invented tradition given by E.P. Thompson. It was mentioned earlier as well. Invented tradition gives us an idea that folklore too could be invented, and with this kind of invention of folklore, it becomes possible to understand that it cannot be reduced into any kind of fossil material. It is a material which is dynamic, which is fluid, which travels across time and space without any kind of necessary romanticism. This idea of folklore emerges from this very useful interface between history and folklore studies. This lecture ends here. In the next lecture, we will go further on about the issues related to folklore. Thank you.